And then other quick housekeeping note too, before we get into introductions and get started, you should see a chat box also on the right-hand side, and it looks like it's working for some folks because I see somebody said they couldn't hear anything, and it's because we weren't started yet. So you can send us questions in the chat box, and if time allows, we'll take breaks during the webinar and take your questions, but at a minimum, we'll take at least 5 minutes to look through all the questions you send in at the end and answer them as much as we can before the webinar wraps up. So I'm Greg Smith, and I'll tell you about myself in a few minutes, but I wanted to introduce Donna Reed, the Agilista PM, and she can give you her background before we get started today.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to meet you. I am Donna Reed, and yes, I'm known as the Agilista PM. And you're going to notice that I do a lot of the same things that Greg does, coaching and training, but I also, I'll work with the team. I'll be their program manager, their release train engineer for scaling Agile. I'll train them. I could be a Scrum master for them if they need to. But I think the key takeaway is both Greg and I, we've been working with a lot of top companies in their markets, and we help them become more agile, so it's fun. Back to you, Greg.
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, Donna and I have been working together, I don't know how long now. I met her at an Orange County PMI meeting, I think at least 10 years ago. And we've done a lot of webinars, at least, yes, and we've done a lot of webinars and things together. And like Donna said, we do very similar things. I don't know, maybe a better description myself, maybe I'd call myself an Agile architect and designer. So I lead transformations, I help people design their workflow, their org structure, determine whether to use Scrum or Kanban, and I basically get highly involved in design, and I try to make Agile transformations organic and then help people customize Agile and Lean to their situation. So that's what I do today. And as we go forward here, Donna and I will actually be speaking to just that, how we've actually been helping people customize Agile along the way, and specifically a common pattern that we're seeing during Agile transformations that we're going to talk about today. So kind of the meat of the webinar today is, I'm guessing, and the target audience for today is people who know Scrum or you're using Scrum already. So we're going to lightly talk about what Scrum is to give us a good foundation and baseline today, but we won't be going deep into Scrum. We're actually going to be talking about how Scrum needs to be supplemented for what we call complete Agile project management. So you probably saw it in your invitation. We're going to talk about some pre-work steps that we do before jumping into sprints and Scrum. And specifically today, we're going to cover envisioning a project, and then getting a project foundation and runway in place, and then doing release planning so we can actually give stakeholders our best estimates on when the project will be done and how much the project will cost. And also, I put a note here at the top of the screen. You will get an email after the webinar, and you won't be on any mailing lists, but we will send you a URL to the recording, and we'll also send you information so you can record your one PDU. So quickly, I'm hoping that everybody on the call is familiar with basic Scrum. It's a great process for delivering continuous value to your stakeholders and to your customers. I'm trying to think, some of the key points are we get a product backlog of needs from our users, and then we determine how much of that master backlog we can deliver in a short time increment. I often use the term a mini project. So most people are doing sprints or these little mini projects in anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. And in my example, it looks like we've got a 4-week example of 30 days. And at the end of our sprint or mini project, we've got a working increment of software. And then we just loop back to the backlog and say, what's the next increment to go after? So Donna and I are certified in Scrum. We've been using Scrum forever. We both love Scrum, but we've actually found over time that Scrum does have some deficiencies. Give me just a second. I'm going to mute some folks. I think we're getting a little background reverb. So some of the areas that we're missing specifically that Donna could speak to, if you'd like, Donna.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're going to talk about today are these 4 bullets. We realize, and we've seen over, the 15 or so years we've been doing this, is that, the sprinting doesn't assume that it assumes that you have everything in place so that you can get started. Things like hardware, licensing, staffing, architecture, all kinds of things have to be ready for the team to start. Well, how do you get that going? We're going to talk about that. The second is, sprinting teams. They like to commit to a sprint at a time, but not an overall project. Now, when you work on projects, especially if you're PMs out there or leaders of teams, your customers want to know, how long is this going to take? What's it going to cost me? And how many people do you need? Well, how do you answer all those questions? You have to do all of that up front, and we're going to talk about that type of thing. And it really comes down to strategic planning. How do you plan so that once you start sprinting, you can just keep going and build out whatever the definition of that value is to your customer? So we're going to talk about all those limitations and how do you address those. Next slide. So what you're going to find are the 3 steps you see on the left-hand side. That's what we're going to get into in more detail. How do you do this? 1, envisioning. 2, foundation work, things like figuring out your sprint length and your environment, prioritizing your backlog. 3 is release planning. How do you figure out what you're going to release first, then second, then third? That's what we're going to focus on. So be sure, we're not going to talk about Scrum. We're going to talk about preparing so that you can Scrum or start sprinting.
And then kind of continuing with what Donna said, maybe a little bit of an uglier diagram, but we're kind of showing here on the bottom, Donna and I break Scrum into 3 steps, if you will, that you can see in the Scrum guide that Sutherland and Schwaber brought us. And we've got sprint planning, and we've got the construction and testing and building work, and then we've got adapting and the review at the end of a sprint. So I think we're all used to those steps. The parts that we don't see covered in Scrum are things like, a lot of you might be project managers, and we have to justify a project. So if you look here, we've got like an envisioning phase where we justify. We have to say whether it's technically feasible. We have to make calls on buy versus build. And even if we've got a beautiful fixed Scrum team, a lot of times we'll get a project where we need different resources than we currently have. So we do still have contract management and resource planning. And Donna and I actually do a classic risk management often at the start of a project before we get into the sprints. And I'm sure a lot of you have got SOX and FDA and FTC governance that you have to take care of and make sure you know what those stakeholders need with every sprint. So that's sort of a foundational activity we do before starting Scrum. And then the last phase that we're going to cover today is release planning. And stakeholders and executives love this. They don't like us to say we only forecast 1 sprint at a time. So in the model we're going to talk about today, we will forecast a long-term estimate, a long-term budget. And then we'll talk about a lot of the things that Scrum really doesn't get into, the change management stuff. You still need a training plan, a communication plan, an org change plan. There's a lot of things that you still need to do with deliveries and releases that Scrum really doesn't cover. So we try to actually address those and get a vision for those before we ever take off. And one thing I should say too before we actually start getting into the first phase here, the envisioning phase, you're looking at a generic template that Donna and I use for public training, but every client, this is different. So maybe these 3 phases we're talking about today don't make sense for your environment, and we could totally understand that. But if we did a bell curve, we would say most of the places we go, these top 3 steps are needed, and they just need to be customized to the situation. But by no means, as you all probably know, Agile isn't prescriptive. And this is just a common pattern that we see that we wanted to discuss today.
Well, as we get into the envisioning phase, let me just share that these 3 phases we're talking to you about, a lot of times people will say, well, that's what Sprint 0 is for. And think Greg and I would both say that it depends on the project. Can you do all of this stuff in a single sprint? A lot of times we found that it takes longer than that. I've been on projects where it takes 6 months to do this strategic planning and setting everything up. So that's why we break it out. And any of you PMPs out there, they call this phase initiation. So that's what envisioning and some of these initial steps are all about that we find even Agile projects have to go through. So let's talk about envisioning. The goal of this phase is trying to get the team to agree on what the value of the project is, the constraints, and what are the initial needs. So we're going to go into detail on some of these key steps, which are listed here, things like an elevator statement. And we'll talk about what that is. We're going to talk about how to list out the constraints and really figure out what's driving the project, because it's going to drive what you can and can't do in the amount of time that you have. We're also going to talk about building out that initial backlog, and we're going to talk about understanding your project well enough so that you can do the research before you can get kicked off. Sometimes you need to do a little bit of homework before you can actually start building things. And we'll get into that in a little more detail as well. Next slide. So what you're this is probably very familiar to the PMPs out there. And maybe if you've only done Agile, you're like, what's a RACI? Well, what we find are it's really important to know what people's roles and responsibilities are, and then you don't get confused. Even in my smallest Agile projects, I want to know, what is my product owner responsible for or accountable for, or who's consultant involved in making that decision, or who's just informed to keep them in touch with what's going on. And so, for example, if we just look at, maybe the third or fourth thing down about grooming the backlog, who's responsible for this? That's the product owner. The project manager, or maybe the Scrum Master, that's the person accountable to making sure it happens. And then the business SME is part of the consulting team making decisions. And then a couple people are informed. But this is a really good tool to put together so that everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are. It helps minimize the confusion. Next slide.
So kind of building on that, once we actually have clear roles, and I should say too quickly that the RACI chart, once we've got it in place and we use it for a couple of sprints, the team usually doesn't have to look at it anymore. So it's a great tool to get started, but we don't go real formal and look at it daily. Once people get a feel for their roles, they become more of a natural collaborative team. So building on that, once we actually know the roles, we actually see, at least I'm seeing, most Scrum training now does talk about establishing a vision for a project and focusing on why we're doing it. And specifically, if you think about chartering, I think of a charter covers why, when, what, where, who, and how. So a charter kind of scopes the project from every aspect. But trying to avoid waste, Agile teams should first start with why and make sure the team and the product owner agree on how. So we suggest that we start a project with an Agile and Scrum team by having the product owner come in with just a light 1 or 2 page business case that strictly speaks to why. And what we love to see them do is to take that light business case and convert it into an elevator statement. And that probably isn't a part of official Scrum to create an elevator statement, but Donna and I have found if the team does this with the product owner, we'll identify the main drivers for the project and how it got justified. And we'll also start synchronizing the product owner's vision into the team. And the team can ask a lot of questions, and they can actually build this 1 paragraph kind of vision together. And it's actually kind of funny. You don't think about Scrum and Agile as having governance, but Donna and I kind of look at the elevator statement as if the product owner and the team can't succinctly summarize in the equivalent of an elevator ride, or about 30 seconds, the value of a project, that's sort of a red flag. So we love to have people create the elevator statement to get everybody synchronized, the main reasons we're here, but also it's a checkpoint. If we can't say succinctly what the main value of the project is, I'm not sure if we should go forward. It might need to go back for some additional research. Maybe a quick summary. We only have an hour today. I could probably spend an hour just on the elevator statement. But it tells us later, once the team's synchronized, when we get the backlog, it tells us what should be at the top of the backlog, which stories, features are most important. It'll also help us make trade-off decisions, always keeping in mind the core goal of the project. And every day when we're working on a sprint, it reminds us who we're serving and how. And of course, like I mentioned, it synchronizes the team on the value and gets their buy-in.
Let's talk about the focus matrix. This is actually a very powerful tool to use. If you look on the left-hand side, you're going to see things like cost, schedule, scope, user experience. You want to ask your customers what is important to them. And a lot of times you'll hear, well, I want everything. And that's when you're talking about features. But if you break it out into, in the PMI world, they call this like the iron triangle of cost, schedule, and scope. Well, there might be other things that drive a project in deciding or helping you decide what's important to do. So the fixed column, that says this cannot be changed. So how you interpret this is user experience, whatever we're defining, that cannot change. But guess what? Emphasize says it's important, it's a key focus, but it's not as important as user experience. Whereas cost and scope, that is flexible. So what does that tell you as a team? What if you're the PM and you have your customer come in and say, listen, I really want to change this feature? You're going to be able to talk and say, listen, you want the user experience fixed and not change. As long as that scope doesn't affect user experience, maybe that's something that you can manage throughout change management. We don't know, but the point of this is helping you to paint a picture with your customer of what's really important and what helps you make decisions for your project. I was on a project recently where one of these lines would have been quality. Well, what would that mean if quality was super emphasized, maybe even was fixed? Maybe that would drive, we've got to fix bugs before we build new features. If that was the most important thing to your customer, then you need to help your team understand, don't work on new features, you need to get the quality up and running.
That's
Next
good,
slide.
Donna. Yeah, and just a quick point too, while we're on here, you can also look at the fixed as meaning it's 100% outside of our control. So some outside circumstance controls it. So it's not a preference. It is like, if we don't do this, we're out of compliance, we don't get paid, and it's not discussable, it's not negotiable. It's outside the control of the company or the team.
Exactly. So on the next slide, this is pretty basic Scrum. It's all about, now we're starting to build out our backlog, and what should be driving that are your users. Find your users. Anybody in UX might call them personas. But so that buyer, they need to be able to bid on items. They also need to be able to record certain things. The seller wants to post items. You want to start driving your backlog from your user point of view. And if there's POs out there, they know that that's exactly what drives a lot of their backlog, the users. Hold on to that thought. Let's go to the next slide. And what we do, if there's POs on the line, and I know there's some, we love to use story mapping or feature mapping, whatever level you're at. And so this, you can see on the wall here, here's a great example of maybe you have the features are the orange, and then the stories are the little yellow stickies. You can use story mapping to build out your backlog. It's a great tool that helps you not only create the backlog, but you can take this back. Let's go to the next slide. What you can do is you can take the left side of the screen, you can take your story map back to your customers. And then I always tell my clients, it tells a story. POs are great at telling the story back to the customer and confirming, here are all the things you said you wanted. Isn't that a better visual than, say, on the right-hand side, let's say you're using Jira or TFS. You just give them this big dump of a database. It's really hard for them to know, what are you telling me? But if you show them the story map, the visual on the left-hand side, it will help them to build out this backlog. It'll help them prioritize. And a lot of times I won't say prioritization. I say, what order do you want to develop these things in? And then they can move the stickies up or down. It's a very, very powerful tool to help plan before you start sprinting. So to the next one, back to Greg.
All right, good. So that's about as much as we can cover on a 1-hour webinar on envisioning. But of all the things we're going to cover today, that probably might be the most important, is getting the product owner and the team synchronized on why we're here. And that first phase we just covered too, it's beautiful for setting up Agile and Scrum, but I would be using those steps even on a waterfall or a Kanban project. I wouldn't care what my method of delivery was. No matter what I'm doing, I want everybody synchronized on why, so we think about it every day. So the next part of our webinar is, I kind of look at sprints as being like train cars. So it's like a train car that pulls up, we load it up with some user stories, 2 weeks later it pulls into the station and they're done. And I look at this next phase, foundation design, as laying out the train track. So it's really kind of hard to have subway cars going without some level of train track underneath them. And then foundation design, that's what we're going to do. We're going to kind of put the early train track in place to support the Scrum train cars, if you will. And once again, I've got 5 steps here, and these are the most common steps that we see with clients. They could be totally different in your situation, but 5 foundational things that we often see done to start an Agile project or a brand new Agile team is, we got to figure out how long our sprint should be. And I actually find people skip this and they just say, well, this is what I used to use at the last place I worked, or I like 1 or 2, and we don't really get scientific about it. And we really do need to get scientific about it if we're using Scrum, because it's a cornerstone, critical, foundational piece of the whole process. And then kind of related to that, we need to know how long, or not, what our sprints look like inside. So not just how long they are, but what ceremonies happen. Then we need to determine how many sprints we're going to have if it's a time box project. And then, of course, the part I mentioned, laying out the train track for the sprints, the servers, environments, the build tools. And then lastly, if we actually do know how many sprints we've got enough train track in place, then we need to prioritize the stories for loading them into the train cars. So let me take you through these 5 areas. So first thing is, we need to determine the correct sprint or iteration length. And Donna and I have like a checklist of like 20 questions, so we didn't want to make this too long of a discussion, but here's just some of the key questions that we look at to help people figure out how long their sprint should be. So things like, how often can our key stakeholders like sit for a demo and give us feedback? Do we need to synchronize with a corporate release schedule or open windows for release? Do we have team members distributed? Because that actually might affect how we lay out our sprints. We need some kind of cadence or structure for dealing with folks offshore or overseas. And then, of course, sprints aren't supposed to be interrupted. So we also want to look at, if we go with too long of a sprint, will the product owner try to cheat and stuff into moving train cars? So these are big questions, but you should definitely cover these and not just jump in and start scrumming. You should put a little forethought and have this discussion with the team and think about a good sprint length for you. And then once you do figure out your sprint length, you might want to lay out your ceremonies and where the key activities happen. So this is actually from a real client I worked with, and it may sound kind of anti-Scrum, but we actually found we needed about 2 days in total to plan their sprints. Around the second day we wrapped up. And then we needed about 2 days at the end of their sprints to actually do the demos, the wrap-ups, and start preparing for the next sprint. And you can see other ceremonies here. You can see when grooming starts for the next sprint. You can see where we do a code review. You could have governance in here where you're actually doing some kind of governance meeting. So whatever you do as a Scrum Master, project manager, you should kind of lay out this template for the team. Every sprint pretty much follows this. And the only parts that are really locked are the start and the end of the sprint. Sprint planning could only take 2 hours for one sprint. The demo and the wrap-up could only take 2. But this is actually laying out for this specific client we worked with. This is typically what it looked like. It's sort of a good checklist for the team and the Scrum Master to look at as we're going through a specific sprint.
Yeah, that's a fabulous tool in projects. So let's take a look at how many sprints for a project. This is where we're getting into the planning stages. And we just took an example of what if your project is date constrained. I need to deliver on March 2019. This is really important because you know where you are today, you know where you have to end. And if you've decided that your sprints are going to be 4 weeks long, that's actually pretty long, but let's just say we're going with 4 sprints. You can actually see between now and March that it's going to be 5 sprints of work to do. This can really, really help you drive how many resources are you going to need to build out your backlog. It's going to help you with a lot of decisions that are needed, so that you can negotiate with your customer on what you're actually building in this quote first release. So this is very, very important. We can see that this one takes 5 sprints to do, and let's just say that you need, 10 people on your team. What if you don't have 10 people? Then all it means is you can go back to the customer or negotiate with the right people to say, listen, what do we need to do to get this done? Or maybe we need to do this in more than one release. But this is just a great step to do to help move in that direction. Let's go to the next slide. Another step that you need to do before you're starting to sprint is taking a look at the architectural runway. Maybe you guys have heard this phrase before, but you can see these bullets. There's a lot of things to think about in projects. How many of your projects are moving stuff into the cloud? Almost every one of my projects is doing that. So guess what? That takes time to build things out, architect things, figure out how the data is going to flow, new modeling. There's so much that you have to do. And you might even have to work with resources outside of the team to get this laid out and going. The key is here is in the waterfall world, you would do it all and then you'd start your project. But since we're an Agile mindset, we want to start sprinting. The key to take away here is you just want to do enough so that the team can start sprinting. So that means part of your backlog could be architectural work that you're giving infrastructure teams to do along the way. But you just want to do enough so you can get the teams going and building out functionality. For the next slide. So now that we've been doing all those pre-architecture work and design, now we have to think about, you can't start sprinting until you have a backlog. So most of you have probably heard MVP, minimal viable product. That means, I always tell my clients, because everybody wants everything, you just say, what do you want in that first release? And so we talk about things like, we go back to that story map or the feature mapping and we say, look, what do you really want? We'll start, doing high level estimates. We'll see what we can do in the amount of time that they're trying to shoot for. But the whole idea here is we're trying to really remove scope and nail down exactly what's the minimal amount of functionality do we need to get this first version out the door. It's a great learning experience for the team. And the PO is typically driving a lot of this, and they're doing a lot of work pre-sprinting. And so I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions about this, but we need to get to an MVP. So let's take a look on the next slide of how we might do that from the story mapping. Basically, we're trying to figure out where to draw that line. So we had all the yellow stickies underneath, for example, register. The customers say, look, I need creating account and deleting account. I can wait for updating and customizing for another release, but I need those two. And what you're doing is you're narrowing down in a very collaborative way with not only your customer, but then you can bring this back to the team and say, guys, we only need to build the stuff above the line out in the first release. And this is a really key part before we start sprinting. So if we go to the next phase, I'll turn it back to Greg.
Thanks.
Of what we do next.
And before I actually leave your slide, which is awesome, a lot of times when we work with product owners, they'll look at this and think we de-scoped their project. And all we want them to know, and it's you know, you and I have both experienced that, and
Yes.
we want them to know that MVP is going to give us feedback that everything we've got below that blue line is still needed. And MVP is almost like an experiment. Before we take the risk of delivering the things below, we'll get confirmation that that's the right way to go, or we'll actually get new stories exposed that we didn't think of that might be more important than the ones below our blue line here. So
absolutely,
always want product owners to know it's not scope, it's just a risk management technique, and it also gives us quicker return on investment. So a lot of really good things from MVP. So Donna set me up nicely. Back in her phase, she actually said, okay, here's how many sprints that we've got if we're time boxed. So she gave me a framework that I can actually put the stories into. So maybe for this project, I know I can like load 5 stories. So I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with story pointing and doing t-shirt sizing and relative estimation. So we still do that in the model that Donna and I have. So we would still go through, do t-shirt sizing. We'd have a prioritized backlog starting with MVP at the top. And then in our model, and we've actually talked a lot of clients into doing this, a lot of our clients are still using classic PMBOK process groups for funding. So they still have an initiation phase where they get money. They still have a planning phase where they get final money. And what we've been able to talk a lot of like Fortune 10 clients into doing is running one reference sprint while we're still in the planning phase, getting the real team together and finding out, like if we went with like a 2-week or 1-week or 4-week sprint, how many points do we think we're going to deliver? We actually run a real sprint while we're still in the planning phase. And once we get a feel for what our velocity is from that real sprint, not from a guess, not from doing a critical path or a Microsoft project plan, then we can actually say it looks like we averaged 32 points a sprint. And then based on the backlog, here's how long we think it's going to take to get through the backlog and finish the project. So in this example, it looks like it'll take the reference sprint plus 4 more to bring home this project. And then
you know
the
what,
beautiful
Greg?
thing,
Go ahead, Greg. I was going to interject that this is very powerful to do. It'll not only help you with what the scope can be, but you're probably in this reference sprint, you'll be able to identify what things haven't you done enough of, because now you'll know if the team's confused. This is very powerful for brand new teams to do that. So you'll also see the gaps that you need to fill before you actually start sprinting so that you can increase velocity.
That's a great point. The other thing too, I know everybody on the phone has experienced this. We have to teach our stakeholders the difference between an estimate and a commitment. And if you publish something like this, it will actually go all across your company in a matter of minutes and be the official end date is Sprint 4. And we actually need to discuss the cone of uncertainty with our stakeholders and say, this is what we know from just running one reference sprint. So if I was going to give this to executives, I wouldn't say we're going to be done in 4 sprints. I'd say we're going to be done in 2 to 6. I would actually give them a range. I would not specifically lock this down. And I would tell them the main reason we're giving you this is so we can do budgeting. We can figure out how many sprints it's going to be and how much it's going to cost. But you can also do planning, like at the program office level of saying, when will this team be done so I can assign another project or initiative to them. So the main purpose is for strategic planning, for budgeting, but it is not a commitment like a sprint. So make sure when you give this to somebody, you say, something like plus or minus 2 sprints. So it's 2 to 6. Don't say 4 sprints exactly will be done, or you'll be seeing that going around email and it'll be turned into a contract for you. So we've actually got through the deck today pretty quickly. We'll actually have time for a lot of questions. And Donna and I can quickly walk you through an overview of where we just been. This doesn't have every step, but you can see what we just did. And actually, I kind of like looking at it like this better because boxes and phases and gates isn't really how projects go. They actually kind of integrate and bleed into each phase. But you can see a nice overview here. And I don't know, Donna, if you want to make some comments on the overview diagram or not.
Yeah, well, this might be a good slide to keep up when we move into Q&A because it'll trigger their mind. I know we haven't told you how to do all this stuff, but these are the steps and the types of things that need to happen before you start sprinting. And so you like Greg said earlier, we customize these things based on the customer, the client, the project we're working on. And so don't think that these things are cast in stone. A great thing is like the focus matrix I talked to you about. You can add things and you can see actually this one has a line for quality. That can be a very common thing to add there to help drive it. So these are, think of it as steps that you do, the types of work that need to happen before you start sprinting. That's probably the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think too, if we think now about kind of classic Scrum, maybe after this project's over, maybe you don't really need all these steps, the 2 columns on the left. You just literally have a backlog like in step 6, and it's constantly being updated with bug fixes and patches and enhancement requests, and you're just scrumming, and you really don't need to do elevator statements or focus matrix or things like that. You're just in a sustaining mode.
I think that's a good point, Greg. I think especially Scrum Masters and PMs, a lot of times they'll go into a project where there's an existing backlog. You, what do I want to tell you? I want to tell you that knowing that these things in the first 2 columns will help you be successful in sprinting, these are great reminders to say, what, for example, how many times have you gone into a client where they give you a backlog and they're not really sure if the prioritization is right or not? Ask yourself what kinds of things in these first 2 columns could help them build confidence in having a good backlog so that you can start sprinting. Well, maybe it's the focus matrix. Maybe it's doing story mapping because they didn't do that. They just put a big wish list together and they really haven't prioritized things. It's just a good reference tool so that you can use to get them going in the right direction. This is a great visual.
Good. So everybody on the lines, whether you came in computer or phone, if you want to go to your chat box and type some questions in, we actually reserved this time just for that. So put your questions in the chat, and then Donna and I will read through them in the next few minutes. In the meantime, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, here's our contact information for Donna and I. If you want to ping either one of us, we're Twitter and LinkedIn, and of course you got email and phone there for both of us. So please go ahead, put your questions in, and I'll actually go back to that slide where you can kind of maybe get a visual of things you may want to ask.
I have a question for the group. Since I'm sure there's a wide variety of roles out there represented. How many of you have been using story mapping and feature mapping to create your backlog? Type in there yes if you have. Oh yeah, I see Heather, Diane, Kaylin. Excellent. Debbie. So you're all story mapping. Yep.
Good. And also, if folks want to email us, we've actually got Jeff Patton's 2-page cheat sheet for story mapping. So drop us a line, and we can mail you a copy of that. It's superb for an overview and showing your teams how to use it.
Yep, absolutely. So we have Heather asking, do we have a recommendation on tools to use for Scrum? I'll let you answer that, Greg.
Well, so somebody said the best Agile tools are low tech and high touch. So we'd actually say don't use a tool unless you have to. But most people have people overseas, or they're trying to integrate several Scrum teams to track together how they're delivering a program increment. So we're seeing tons of good tools. I mean, people that we see in Microsoft environments are often using Team Foundation Server from Microsoft. When I'm actually in a Java world, I used to see people using Jira. And in general, I see Jira used a lot. I'm also seeing a lot of people using the tools from Computer Associates. There are just a ton of good tools. And actually, I probably see 10 tools a year. And tools usually aren't the problem. They're usually highly configurable. I usually see just more of they choose a tool based on the technology they're using, because if I'm already in Visual Studio with Microsoft, it's easy to just go ahead and use Team Foundation Server. And if I'm actually using Jira and I'm using a lot of the tools that I can get that go with Jira building, it easily integrates into Jira also and all the other Atlassian tools. So tools, I don't know if there's any we'd recommend. We'd actually say go without if you can, but if you have to, you can ping us about specifics, but I haven't seen a bad tool yet. It's more which one's a better fit for the kind of work you're doing.
I absolutely agree. Excuse me, guys, I'm losing my voice. But I think you have to remember that Agile is all about making the work visible. That's the key. So whatever tool you use, how can you keep things visible? That's why story mapping is so powerful, because that's a story. It tells a story. It's visual. It's a picture. If I just give them a dump of 100 stories, what story does that depict for someone? It's much harder. In Agile, if you make things visible, fabulous. Do that. The next question is, let's go to Curtis. He says the velocity of a reference sprint could be suspect because everyone is just getting going. You're right. How do you adjust? So I know this is great. I'll give you my 2 cents, question. And Greg, you know what? You're absolutely right. So the reference sprint, especially for a new team, is not going to be the fastest. It's probably going to be the slowest they ever go. And I think it actually sets you up for success, because you can see, let's say the team did 20 points. Well, what you can then go back and tell your customers is, listen, it looks like the team, and you have to explain to them that the team is going to ramp up and get faster as they work with each other over time, especially if they're brand new. But you're going to say, look, we can at least do 20 points a sprint. Let's take a look at how long that's going to take if that's the best we can do. But then you can talk about if they ramp up, then maybe the timeline could be pulled in. And that refers back to what Greg was talking about. It could be between 2 to 6 sprints to get this project done. But he based that off of the reference sprint. And so it's an education you do with your customers to say, well, it depends on the resources and what they can do. Would you add anything, Greg?
Oh yeah, a couple of things I would add. So first, Curtis, you're right. It is like our worst one, so we sort of get like a free buffer. But then after every sprint, we'll adjust our velocity and our projection. So if our first reference sprint was 20 points and our next one was 40, we'll actually adjust the backlog and say from here on out we think we're going to do 30. So we'll do typically a rolling average of the last 3. So it won't be this is the only time. But when we went for funding, we did have a buffer. So you're right, it's one of the slower sprints. But I will tell you this too, Curtis. True experience working with a monster energy company, and they follow PMBOK phases for funding. And I talked them into doing a reference sprint and using that for funding to actually say this is how many sprints we think it will take. And their controller said it was a factor of 5 times more accurate to use a reference sprint than to do classic waterfall planning and doing a work breakdown structure and laying critical path out for 5 or 6 months. That he actually found that reference sprints were much more accurate than their historical planning process. So it's not perfect. We're still high in the cone of uncertainty. It's still a guess, but it's one of the best guessing tools out there. And then we start quickly, and then we really do start learning how long it will take, and we constantly adjust our projections as we start getting a rolling average on our sprints. So that's a great question. I think I saw another one too, Donna. Gosh, somebody was actually mentioning, I think, about working in an enterprise environment. Yeah, so I said a question from Lisa, I think it is. I struggle with having a client understand how big the effort usually is to bring up environments from 80 servers to 3 servers. It's always a challenge. Do you have anything more specific when it comes to a big enterprise environment? You want to start with that one, Donna?
Sure. No, this is a common challenge, Lisa. You know what my secret is I make that work part of the backlog. And maybe that's the early stuff, and estimate that work, because unless they see that this is part of the project and this is how much work it's going to take and here are the resources I need to make that happen, a lot of times they'll just push back and say, no, just start coding. And like, well, you can't start coding until you have the infrastructure in place. And so I'll just use hey, let's do a architecture infrastructure backlog and make that part of MVP. It's just one way that I do it. Greg, do you have another way that you deal with it?
No, that's a good method, and I think there's twofold. One is if your customer has any history, you can show them in the past how long it's taken on similar projects to get the servers up. So give them, we almost do like story point estimation, referring to a previous story. We could refer to a previous project and say, remember that project? This is about the same size, so it's going to take about the same amount of time. But then we can also be working this from the other side. Hopefully your architects aren't trying to lay out the perfect environment for everything that we can envision going into the backlog. Hopefully they're just doing a runway and they're thinking about MVP architecture, so we can kind of meet the customer where they live. We actually want to balance both worlds. We do need a runway, but if we try to do perfect architecture, by the time we're done with it, the need from the customer may be gone. So I don't know your world, but we should be working it both ways. Keep teaching them it's realistic to think we need some time to get this, but then also on our side, we shouldn't be trying to go for waterfall architecture and nail it all up front. If we do that, we actually might miss the need, because a lot of Agile projects, the date's as much a requirement as the user stories themselves.
Absolutely. And if any of you are dealing with some scaled Agile environments where you have more than one team, SAFe is one of those frameworks, and they call it PI planning. And PI planning is those 2 days up front where you bring in all the teams to plan it out. Well, one of those teams might be the architecture infrastructure teams, and they're actually planning out their sprints as well based on the MVP, the features that are being built, and that will help them figure out, what do I need to do in sprint 1 so that the other team can start developing stuff in sprint 1 and sprint 2. How do I set them up so they can get going? It's a great visual to address what Greg is talking about. So you might look up SAFe and PI planning and see how that they do that. It's a great way to address that problem.
That's a great point. I forgot we're SAFe Agilist. I forgot about that. We got another question too, Donna. I don't know if you can see this one or not, the one from Ben. He says, the Scrum team I work with has struggled to have automated tests done. From your experience, do you have some recommendations on how to tackle it? Do they have tests automated or manually, or mainly done manually? So a question about, I think, about functional tests and getting them automated.
Oh yeah, I just found it. Go ahead, you answer it first. Let's see if I'll add anything.
Sure. So not to get too deep for a 1-hour webinar, but hopefully away from functional tests, the developers are writing unit tests for their code, and they're making those a part of the build process. So they're doing what we call continuous integration, where they actually write a script, and once they actually see the script test, then they actually make it a part of the build process. And anytime a developer makes a change, when they check in their code, those automated unit tests run, and they make sure the build hasn't been blown up by a fellow developer. So that's the first line of defense. And then to your main question, I usually see the server side, the middle tier test getting automated, and then a lot of people are buying tools that do the front end, but the front end's hard, and you can have a lot of variables. So I'm seeing more manual testing for UI, but there's still a lot of tools out there, but more standardization across the board on the middle level and the back tier level, the server level. So I do see typically more automation there, but the front end, you almost have to do a justification. Like, if I do this test and write it, is the front end going to stay the same, and the criteria, and can I use this to regress every sprint, or is it such a variable I should just keep this one manual? And I think the other thing too, Donna and I do like this kind of Pareto kind of thing. If people say they're struggling to have regression testing, like, I used to work for a company called Washington Mutual, and we were moving to automation, but in the meantime, we're like, we want to get onto the next sprint, but we still want to have a regression test in place. So at the end of every sprint, we would look at all the tests, and we would say, what 20% covers about 100% of what we delivered? So it's not every test, but if we run these key 20% tests, it'll actually exercise most of the system, and we'll know that we haven't broke something. So we would just typically automate only 20% per sprint that we thought would hit most of the functionality. And that worked well for us. So we sort of had our cake and ate it too. We didn't have to automate everything, but we still had the goal of automated testing. We had regression and protection, and it was rare to find something that would break something, but the 20 tests wouldn't catch, or the 20% test wouldn't catch.
I'll add one thing, and I absolutely agree. That's exactly what Greg and I do. So Ben, one of the things that Scrum talks about a lot is defining what done is. And I think as a PM or a Scrum Master, you have to ask your team and your who you're working with, what does it mean to be dev done before that you pass it off to QA? Do I have to have my automated test done? And I've been on so many environments where they think of that later, and so you have a lot of catching up to do. Try to ask that right up front. That's part of the pre-sprinting, is setting the expectations. And everything that Greg said is how to tactically address it, but even strategically up front, ask, is automated tests needed? Because manual is going to take longer, and you're going to heavily wait on UAT. So if you move into the UAT phase, that the users are going to be, you're going to depend on them a lot to find bugs if you haven't automated the scenarios and stuff up front. So talk about that.
Yeah, great point.
What's our next
question?
We
have another question. Would you have any points on safe versus less versus disciplined Agile? Safe has been getting criticism, especially over less large-scale Scrum. So I got lots of opinions. Donna, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just say it like it is. I'm a straight shooter. This is a political question. You have people who love Scrum of Scrums. You have people who love less. You have people who love safe. What I tell people, I just told someone yesterday this. They said, I hate safe. And I said, why? And they didn't have an answer. So I said, you know what? I will tell you this. I said, there's pros and cons for all this stuff. All right, that's the real answer. So what I like about SAFE is they have been willing to tell you that if you're in a scaled environment, it's not enough to talk about teams. It's not just Scrum of Scrum. You have to involve the program level. Sometimes you have to involve the portfolio level. Maybe you need new roles and responsibilities to make scaled Agile work. I love that, because that goes back to like Lisa's question about the architecture. No one wants to admit that has to get done. No, put it on the table and say, listen, if you have scaled teams, you need maybe a program manager or a release train engineer. You can't just have a bunch of Scrum teams figuring it out on their own. How many of you have been put into that situation? I have, years ago. I will never be put in that situation again, because don't just make the teams figure it out on their own. They won't, because it's proven through studies that teams will compete. Well, how do you remove that competition? Whether it's less or DAD or safe, you just have to be aware of that social side of things, that teams will compete. So you need things in place. So I say, look at your project. How many teams do you have? You want to try to have the least amount of dependencies as possible. There are philosophies around scaling Agile that I don't care what framework you use, you need to do. And so SAFE has, essential SAFE. It doesn't have to be the big, 4 or 5 levels of SAFE. That's my opinion. This is very political, and people are very passionate about what they will or won't do. I step back and talk about practices and principles and say, how are we going to do this? How do we make sure this doesn't happen, like teams competing? What would you add, Greg?
Oh, those are great points. So I think, I got trained by, I think the guy's name's Alex Yakami, I think his name is.
He's from SAFE.
Yeah, I think he's second down the chain, and I think I just got lucky that I got him as a trainer, and this was 4 years ago. And the first thing he said, the first 30 seconds is, you can pick and choose the parts you use. Mm-hmm. And the people I see complaining about scaled Agile are using it prescriptively. They're actually looking at the diagram you mentioned, essential, safe, and they're saying, I've got to do all those things. And Alex said in my workshop, if you just want to do PI planning and do it your way and not use any else parts of the safe framework, you don't have to. So totally can customize safe to your situation. And I think when it gets bad press, it's because somebody's saying it's prescriptive and you've got to do all these steps. But I would say, and to this question, one flavor that's not mentioned in here is Jeff Sutherland has just released Scaled Scrum in the last 2 years or so. I heard him present on it at the Agile conference. And if I wasn't a safe Agilist, which I love safe, the next one I would probably look at is Jeff's. because I do believe in him. He started Scrum. He knows what he's doing, and his looked very non-prescriptive. And he had great case studies where he used it with BMW and Munich to do the self-driving car, and how you do a scrum of scrums from the team level through the program level all the way up to the executives every day. So the one that's not mentioned here is the scaled Scrum, and I'm actually reading up on it now. I'm actually reading, he's got a scaled Scrum framework, almost like there's a Scrum guide. There's a scaled Scrum guide too, and I'm reading that to see his perspective and actually thinking about maybe blending some of those practices when I do safe transformations. So great question. I show 2 minutes left. Donna, I don't know if there's any questions left in the queue or not.
Yeah, let's do one from Heather. I think this is a common question. Do you ever see the need for waterfall combined with Scrum? The quick answer, yes, all the time. And so, Greg and I, years ago, we used to present Agile and waterfall on two different sides of a big skateboard, ramp. So, you know what? Clients are somewhere between those two things. They're trying to either become agile from waterfall, or they're maybe very agile. And you have to take that into consideration and meet your company where they're at. And so, yes, you will absolutely have to do that. And how you address that, there's lots of ways to do that. We just don't have time to go into that. Greg, would you add anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, just on that waterfall question, Agile principles should be applied to every project. And we don't have the principles up on the screen, but the principles are universal. And then maybe you don't deliver in Scrum or sprints, but you can still be Agile. You can still deliver sequentially like waterfall does and still follow Agile principles of delivering early value, transparency, customer and team being synchronized. The Agile principles should be used on every project, whether we follow a sequential waterfall delivery or not.
Absolutely. We could talk for hours.
We could. So, maybe there's our next webinar. Maybe we'll do Agile versus waterfall.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and feel free to reach out to Greg and or I anytime. We're happy to talk and chat and see how we can help you guys. But the holidays are here, so happy holidays to everyone.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. And I think I mentioned we'll be sending out an email with PDU information, and then Donna and I will get this webinar up on a website and send you the URL so you can also watch it again. Thank you again. Great questions. Hope to cross your path soon.
Thank you, Donna and Greg. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Miss you.